What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we're doing another faction-focused article for Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Today's is Orks, and I had high hopes for the Ork reveal article. We've had some really creative articles recently, things like Chaos Knights and Adeptus Custodes, that have taken the 9th edition mechanics of a faction and transitioned them in a way that's really kind of fulfilling into the 10th edition framework. Orks doesn't seem like we're going to get that. Instead, we have kind of a one-to-one translation of the Ork abilities from 9th edition into 10th edition with a significant depowerment in line with the other depowerments that we've seen from similar factions. And it's a little bit unfortunate, but let's dive in to exactly what I mean. First is the Ork army ability, the WAAAGH. If you have played against Orks or with them in the 9th edition of the game, you'll notice that this rule looks eerily familiar. Once per game at the start of a battle round, you can call the WAAAGH, and until the end of that battle round, you get Advance and Charge, +1 Strength and Attack, and a 5+ Invulnerable save for your Ork models. These are basically the benefits of the 9th edition WAAAGH mechanic, but with some very notable differences. First off, it's not restricted to core characters, so that's nice for the Advance and Charge. You can Advance and Charge with everything, including vehicles and monsters like kill rigs. The weird part is, though, the timing has changed in a very significant way. You now call the WAAAGH at the start of the battle round, not the start of your turn. Previously, it would trigger in your command phase, and so you could do it proactively. The turn that you wanted to get in and get an Advance and Charge, you would immediately have the ability to Advance and Charge and get your combat bonuses right off the bat. Now, if you are the second player, the timing is super bizarre. You call the WAAAGH at the start of your opponent's turn. It gives you a 5+ Invulnerable save for that turn, which is good, but you don't get to make use of the Advance and Charge or extra attacks until it comes to your turn. So not only do you have to sit there and survive a round, but your opponent gets a movement phase to react to you. I think there's going to be some situations where your opponent is going first, they ask you if you're declaring a WAAAGH, you say no, and suddenly they get to move a little bit more aggressively because your throw range is lower. Similarly, you call a WAAAGH at the start of the turn, hoping for some long charges, and your opponent just backs off for a bit, maybe feeds you some chaff, and your WAAAGH is entirely wasted. And this is going to hurt even more given the fact that the WAAAGH no longer echoes. Previously, it had an echoing effect where turn 1, as soon as you declared the WAAAGH, you would get a big benefit, and it would get a lesser benefit on the second turn, finally petering out in the third turn and no longer affecting your army. In this case, it no longer does that, so you only get it for the battle round in which you declare a WAAAGH. Once that's over, it's gone forever. So between it being less powerful and more awkward to use than the previous incarnation, I'm less impressed by this WAAAGH than I am by the 9th edition one, and given the fact that it's basically identically the same ability, there is a direct comparison there. We're not comparing apples to oranges, we're comparing apples to a slightly smaller, more gross-looking apple. But that's not the only rule that Orks get. They also get a detachment rule for their released detachment, the unimaginatively named WAAAGH Tribe. This gives you sustained hits 1 on Ork models from your army. It's basically a reinterpretation of the Goths sub-faction ability that most Ork lists had in 9th edition. However, Goths also gave you +1 strength in the first round of combat, which Orks will no longer get. It doesn't seem like their profiles have changed that much, so that is something that we have to keep in mind. That said, sustained hits 1 is pretty good, and especially given the fact that it doesn't require you to charge or have any other riders, it just gives you exploding 6s in melee, which, as we should remember, is roughly equivalent to +1 to hit. So if you have rerolls or something like that, it's going to make you more effective, but otherwise, most of your Orks will statistically basically just hit on 2s, which is, not too bad. But the real question is what units are getting the benefit here, and we do have a couple pretty impactful datasheets spoiled. The first one are Beast Snagga boys that have gotten a couple changes, but for the most part look like a translation of the 9th edition datasheet. They have gone up a speed value up to movement 6. They retain their toughness of 5, got an improved save characteristic, and actually some enhanced resilience from not only their 5+ save, but also a 6+ feel no pain. Previously, they had a 6+ invulnerable save, but that always had like a weird interaction with the WAAAGH, because you would declare the WAAAGH the turn that they disembarked from their transports to charge, and then their built-in invulnerable save wouldn't come into play for another 2 battle rounds, which mostly didn't matter. In this case, they have a 6-up feel no pain built in, which they can take on top of their WAAAGH 5-up invulnerable or their 5-up armor save, and given the fact fact that AP values are generally lower, that 5-up armor save is actually very relevant. Not to mention the fact that they can benefit from cover, so they can stand in cover and get a 4+ armor save, which is most likely not going to get negated by enemy shooting. So they are legitimately kind of tough to kill. They have a mediocre leadership value of 7 and an OC of 2, as we can expect from battle line infantry. They do retain their Monster Hunter's ability, which now gives them rerolls to hit against monsters and vehicles. This is very good, especially given the fact that they will have sustained hits built in. So they're hitting on 3s, rerolling the hit roll, 6s explode, so they actually will most likely get more hits than they make attacks, specifically against monsters and vehicles. The attacks that they are making are pretty decent. They have some ranged attacks that, generally speaking, are not that exciting. Sluggas and thump guns with a 5+ ballistic skill and AP 0. Probably not doing too much damage with those things, but the melee weapons are where it's at. Most of the unit are equipped with choppas. These are 3 attacks per model at strength 5 AP 1, basically the profile that we've seen in the past. However, they have lost a little bit of their built-in strength bonuses. Previously, you would take them in Goffs, they would get +1 strength from the charge, and then +1 strength from the WAAAGH, getting them up to strength 7, and now they're capped at strength 6. So overall, a little bit of a depowerment, but they are going to be swinging 4 times with rerolls against vehicles and exploding 6s on the WAAAGH turn, which is pretty good. If they've elected to take a thump gun, they replace that chopper with a close combat weapon, which is only 2 attacks and AP 0, and the knob gets his Powa Snappa. This is a 4-attack weapon, hitting on 3s at strength 7, AP 1. 2 damage. Overall, trading 1 point of AP for an extra built-in attack on that knob, which is definitely worth it. It's worth noting as well that the knob does retain his 2 wounds, so he is going to give the unit a little bit of resilience, and that's actually very relevant given that 6+ feel no pain. That means you can assign 2 damage attacks to the knob, and there is a non-zero chance he shrugs one of those 2 damage and actually survives the attack. Ultimately, I think mostly a side grade for the Beast Snaggas. They do have some very relevant survivability increases, although for the most part, Feel No Pain 6+ is a little bit of an annoying ability to have on a 1 wound unit. Because it's baked in with some mediocre but relevant saving characteristics, I think actually Beast Snaggas are going to feel more resilient than they have in the past. Their melee profiles got a little bit worse, but that is the case for everything in the game, so that's mostly to be expected. Now, one way we can buff these guys is by including a character with them, and we do see the biggest of the characters in this spoiler article. TacticalTortoise has been revealed, and he is kind of a doozy, honestly, of a model. Without knowing more units in the codex, he's very difficult to analyze because he has a lot of supportive effects. TacticalTortoise previously was a big monster. He had a 4-wound phase cap and hit like an absolute Mack truck, but he could be shot at by your opponent's army and was relatively slow, so he was kind of a late game piece, which didn't make so much sense. In this case, however, he does get the leader ability, so he is going to be joining into units and granting them buffs. He's also included in a unit with Makari, who previously was an independent character. This makes a lot more sense because not only is Makari able to take damage for Gaskell, which is pretty good, but also it was just weird that they were 2 independent characters. Just didn't really make sense. Gaskell is a little bit slower than his boys at only a 5-inch movement, and he is only toughness 6. He does have a built-in 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ armor save, making him on the tougher side of orc characters, however. It is worth noting that while Makari is only 1 wound, he retains toughness 6, so there's no weird toughness chicanery with Gaskell. You're just going to be rolling against toughness 6 if you're hitting him, but also he has a 2+ invulnerable save. It is a unrerollable invulnerable save, basically making Makari the equivalent of a shadow field for TacticalTortoise. He's going to be able to take 2+ invulnerable saves until one of those is failed. Makari then dies immediately, and Gaskell reverts to his 4+ invulnerable save, but it does make Gaskell incredibly resilient against conventional attacks. Now, there are a couple idiosyncrasies with this. First off, if he is attached to a unit with the leader ability, you cannot assign saving throws to those characters unless it is specifically with precision. Until the bodyguard unit is dead, Gaskell and Makari cannot take damage. So you can't use Makari as an invulnerable save to tank hits for the remainder of the unit. He can only tank hits for Gaskell. That said, I did mention the precision keyword earlier. This is a weapon ability that allows you to assign saving throws to a visible character in the unit you're attacking rather than the unit itself, and unfortunately, the attacking player chooses the character being assigned saving throws. So, as long as TacticalTortoise is visible to the attacking unit, if they have precision, they can assign those attacks to Gaskell himself, regardless of whether or not Makari has already taken saving throws earlier in that turn. This can create an awkward situation where Gaskell is wounded, and if his surrounding unit is killed, then he is the only eligible model to be assigned saving throws. So Gaskell will actually die before Makari if your opponent has started to deal damage to him with precision weapons. It's very weird, and I kind of wish that Makari just had a rule that forced him to take saves first, but it is what it is. Makari does have some additional benefits as well, however. He gives lethal hits to any Orc units within 12 inches of Makari himself. Not his unit and not Ghazghkull, only Makari, the guy with the little flag. Lethal hits is a pretty effective ability, especially if you're getting those reroll hits. So if we're seeing Beast Snaggis, for example, charging into a vehicle, despite the fact that the vehicle is probably high toughness and they're winning on 6s, they can reroll all of their hit rolls in order to try to fish for critical hits, which will then convert into automatic wounds, which is pretty useful. This is a pretty great ability, especially when combined with Ghazghkull's Prophet of the Great WAAAGH ability. This gives his attached unit +1 to hit and +1 to wound. Importantly, it's only when he's leading a unit, so I don't believe he affects himself with his buff if he's not inside that unit. So if his unit gets removed, I think Ghazghkull kind of loses a little bit of steam. The wording's sort of strange. It affects the unit that he's leading, but it's unclear whether or not he's included in that unit. It's not using the nomenclature that the leader ability actually refers to. It should either refer to an attached unit, which is the character plus bodyguard, or the bodyguard specifically, which is the unit that the character's attached to. It just says the unit that he's leading, so I think it actually needs an errata, which is kind of funny. That said, he himself is a pretty decent profile without any buffs. He does have Mork's Roar, his big 4-barrel big shooter. It hasn't really gotten too much of a glow up. It's basically the same as it was in 9th edition. A 12-shot rapid-fire 4-weapon at 36-inch range, so it's able to fire pretty far down range and get 16 attacks if firing within 18 inches at strength 5, AP 0, 1 damage for, unfortunately, only a 5+ ballistic skill. Lots of attacks, but not very accurate, so just good for plank damage. It is unfortunate because I think that's one of the coolest guns in the Orc Codex. It just looks so meaty. I wish that it did more damage. His melee weapons, however, have always been where things are at. Gork's Claw is his big melee attack. Now, this used to be strength 14, but with only 5 attacks. However, he would gain additional attacks but lose strength as he was degraded. Now his profile's basically just been averaged out. He has more base attacks than he had in 9th edition, but they're always at his highest strength characteristic. Overall, he's actually going to hit a little bit harder than he did in 9th, at least in terms of his attacks and strength. He did lose a point of AP, going from AP 4 down to AP 3. Again, basically every melee weapon in the game did, so that's not too surprising. It does hit on 2s at strength 14, AP 3 for a flat 4 damage, and keep in mind that on the WAAAGH turn, when Ghazghkull's most likely to get into melee, he's going to be 7 attacks at strength 15, relevant if he's going into big meaty stuff like monoliths. If he is benefited from his own wound roll buff, he's going to wound basically every profile in the game on 2s. Makari also has a little shank as well. It is only a 4+ weapon skill at strength 3, but does have devastating wounds, which is adorable. Able to convert a mortal wound on a wound roll of 6, because Makari's so lucky, he's just gonna get you in your jugular. Overall, Ghazghkull Thraka is kind of a wild side grade from his 9th edition incarnation. He's less of a single model powerhouse and more of an army support piece. He's lost his reroll aura, unfortunately, and his buff to the WAAAGH, but the unit he's attached to is going to be absolutely lethal. +1 to wound on a high volume unit, like a big squad of Orc boys, for example, is absolutely terrifying. And you get +1 to hit plus sustained hits, meaning that most Orc units will probably convert equal to or more than the number of attacks that they started with when they go to swing, which is a lot. It is also important to note that he's been converted to the infantry keyword rather than monster, so he, if it still exists in 9th edition, will be able to go through breachable terrain and benefit from other benefits that infantry can get. He can also get cover by standing in terrain, so you can go to a 1+ armor save, potentially. Ghazghkull Thraka himself is pretty sweet, and if you're not able to precision him, once his unit gets wiped out and he and Makari are left standing, if there's no wounds carried over to one of the models in the unit, Makari is actually going to make him ridiculously hard to kill, since you can just start to assign everything to Makari himself. It's not a totally immovable object, since there are a lot of devastating wounds and mortal wound output in the shooting phase in 9th edition now, so if Makari starts taking damage and then your opponent converts a devastating wound onto him, he's going to have to take it, it's going to bypass his invulnerable save and kill him, but it will mean that conventional attacks that aren't inflicting mortals will have a very difficult time actually doing damage to Ghazghkull. A little bit hard to rate this guy without experience in the table, honestly, and without seeing the units he can attach to. If Mega Knobs have a billion attacks at high strength and high damage, +1 to hit and wound on them is going to be amazing, and like I said before, we do actually need to get some clarification on how his ability works. Now, moving on further into the article, we do see some weapons spoiled, some from the Stompa, the Def Cannon, and Mega Choppa. Without seeing the Stompa's profile itself, it's a little bit hard to judge these. The Def Cannon is a 3d6 ballistic skill 5, strength 14, AP 3, D6 damage blast cannon. Very good profile, but that 5-up ballistic skill and random attacks and damage is a little bit disconcerting. However, the Mega Choppa are where things are at. You can either swing with a strike profile at 6 attacks, hitting on 3s, and strength 24, AP 5 for 10 damage. Important to note that goes to strength 25 on the WAAAGH turn, so that's super relevant. This thing will basically automatically kill vehicles it touches. It wounds like 90% of the vehicles in the game on 2s, ignores entirely their armor save, and kills them in probably 1 swing, but maybe 2. They can also open some smaller cans too. They have a very good profile at killing medium infantry. The sweep profile is 18 attacks at weapon skill 3, strength 10, AP 2, 3 damage. This means it wounds Terminators on 2s, puts them on their invulnerable save perfectly, and kills them with every converted attack. So this thing will probably kill like 6 or 8 Terminators in 1 swing. Honestly, alongside the buffs that they potentially get from the WAAAGH, Stompa seem like an absolute slap. It's also a vehicle, so it can tank shock, and I mean, we'll have to see the points value and exactly what the rest of its profile look like, but Stompas seem pretty great. We also see the squig launchers return from the Ruckatruck squig buggy. This thing was absolutely horrifying for a while in 9th edition and basically broke the game. And squig launchers come back with a D6 plus 6 shot profile, hitting on 5s at strength 5, AP 1, 2 damage. Now, I think that this profile is representing all of the squig launchers on the Ruckatruck squig buggy, although they have 2. One of them always had a different profile in the 9th edition codex, and it's not clear if that one's going to be separate from this squig launcher on the squig buggy. Given that it has more attacks than it did in 9th edition, I assume that this is all of the launchers together, but there is a potential that squig buggies have more attacks than this. It is a blast, ignore cover, indirect fire weapon. Hilariously, we see most of the indirect fire weapons that have been spoiled in the game so far also ignore cover, which means that the benefit you get from being fired at by indirect fire weapons, which is that you permanently get cover, doesn't do anything. I imagine most of the indirect fire in the game will not ignore cover. This one specifically does because the squigs are supposed to be chasing you around buildings and stuff. You can't hide in a ruin when the squig is just jumping over it. Honestly, this profile is a little bit uninspiring though, unless you can source a lot of hit bonuses. If it's firing indirectly, it's hitting on 6s, 5s if you buff it with a mech, but even then at only AP 1, most things in the game are going to be pretty resilient against it. Firing indirectly with a mech bonus, you're still hitting on 5s, so D6 plus 6 shots only hits 3 or so, and that's not really breaking the bank, honestly. Most armies can withstand that for multiple turns without really losing too much. It does look like indirect fire is returning in 10th edition in a big way, but it doesn't look like it's quite as broken as it was at some points in 9th. Last but certainly not least, we do have a stratagem. This is basically directly out of the Space Marine reveal too, and it is the return of Orks is Never Beaten. This was the stratagem that allowed Ork characters to fight on death, and now it works on any Ork unit. It's basically just only in Death to Duty End from the Space Marine Codex, but Orks can use it. So if you remember that from the Space Marine preview article back in the day, it's the same stratagem. You can fight on death with a unit. After the attacking unit has finished its attacks, you get to swing with all the dead models, and this actually gives Orks a lot of defensive attributes from their WAAAGH. If they're receiving a charge, they get all the attack bonuses that they can use when they fight on death, and they can stack that with the invulnerable save that they'll get against the incoming attacks. So it does give Orks a little bit more optionality for taking the hit on the chin. It's less aggressive than I think Ork players would want to play, but it does give them a lot more options. Here We Go returns as a stratagem rather than a special rule on the Ork datasheets, and it is a bizarre one. I almost hope that this isn't actually how the stratagem works, because it does not seem like it works very well. It's a 1 CP stratagem used at the start of your movement phase and adds +2 to advance and charge rolls made for an Ork infantry unit from your army. The reason that this timing is weird is, well, it's great on your WAAAGH turn, because you're going to add 4 inches to the total threat range of the unit that you are moving. Because it's the start of your movement phase, if you're embarked in a transport, assuming that the embarkation restrictions remain from 9th edition, you are actually not able to use this on a unit disembarking a transport. In addition, if you have effects like the Weird Boy, who's teleporting a unit from one side of the table to the other, you don't actually know if the Weird Boy's power has successfully been cast before you use the stratagem. So you could target a unit, give it +2 to advance and charge, and then try to teleport them, fail, and be wildly out of position. In addition, if it's not your WAAAGH turn, you're suddenly spending a CP 3 phases in advance of the charge phase to give them a buff on their charge roll. So whether or not you even need the extra 2 inches, you don't even know. This seems very specifically aimed at buffing your WAAAGH charges, but in every other situation, this timing is insanely bizarre. I almost wonder if there are more effects within the datasheets themselves that will count you as being under the effects of the WAAAGH and allow you to advance and charge. If that's the case, then this stratagem is great, but if not, I mean, it's really good on that one WAAAGH turn, and then it's kind of just weird. So anyway, let me know down in the comment section what you think about this Orc preview article. I think it's interesting. I actually really like the look of Gaskell Thraka. I think he's actually pretty good if the price is right. The rest of the reveals, though, a little hit or miss. Stompa seems great, but the fact that the Orc abilities basically are just 9th edition abilities ported over to 10th edition it feels kind of lazy. Also, the detachment rule, WAAAGH tribe, like, come on, guys. Come up with something more creative. This feels like a little bit of a phone-in, but we'll just have to see the rest of the Orc datasheets. And with that, thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.